Welcome to the Explainer. Look, physics-based Melee in VR has been tried dozens, maybe hundreds of times by now. But as any seasoned headset owner knows, most of those implementations, they just feel totally weightless. Today, though, we're looking at a game that just launched on April 27th for Quest 3 and Steam VR. It's called One More Delve, and it's getting some serious attention for actually doing things differently. So, let's dig in.
But first, we've really got to address the elephant in the virtual room here. Why do so many VR swords feel like literal pool noodles? If you've played a decent amount of VR Melee games, you know exactly the widespread frustration I'm talking about. You swing this massive, heavy battle axe, it connects with a heavily armored goblin, and it just awkwardly phases right through them. There's no weight to it, it just completely shatters your immersion, right? You end up just relying on these cheap, rapid wrist flicks to exploit the damage numbers instead of actually engaging in real swordplay. Well, One More Delve was built specifically to kill that wiggle sword mechanic once and for all.
So here is our tactical quest log for today's Explainer. 1. What is One More Delve? 2. The physics combat breakdown. 3. Co-op and replayability. And 4. The Standalone Quest 3 verdict. All right, kicking things off with Section 1. What is One More Delve? A new contender enters the dungeon.
At its absolute core, One More Delve is a physics-based hack-and-slash dungeon crawler, and it is built entirely around a highly addictive roguelite loop. Basically, you and up to 2 friends drop into these procedurally generated, randomized dungeons. You fight your way through the rooms, take out the locals, scoop up their loot, and, if you actually manage to survive, you extract back to a social hub. Once you're there, you use all those materials and the gold you gathered to craft new gear and upgrade your weapons before diving right back in. It's a classic loop for sure, but the actual execution is where this game really shines.
Now, the absolutely crazy part here is the development background. This entire title was shipped by a solo student developer at a studio called ATVR. Just think about that. Managing to release a physics-heavy game simultaneously across Steam VR, the Meta Quest 3, and the new Quest 3S as a single developer, that is a massive technical feat.
Moving right along to Section 2, the physics combat breakdown, or solving the hitbox problem.
To really understand what makes this game special, we have to look at exactly how it processes damage. Most standard VR combat operates on what analysts like to call hitbox theater. Basically, the game just looks at overlapping collision volumes. If your controller's hitbox touches the enemy's hitbox, boom, it calculates damage. It honestly doesn't care how hard you swung. But One More Delve entirely abandons that for rigid body physics. This is a system we usually only see reserved for heavy PC VR titles like Blade and Sorcery, but here it is actually running on Standalone. The Unreal Engine 5 framework here literally calculates kinetic energy. It takes the virtual mass of your specific weapon and multiplies it by the physical acceleration of your actual real-world hand. So if you don't swing with real physical momentum, your sword is literally just going to slide off an enemy like a wet noodle. And these rigid body mechanics force real physical discipline on the player. Take the centroid waist balance calculations for weight simulation, for example. A one-handed rusted longsword is going to handle completely differently than a massive two-handed warhammer. Then you've got environmental collision. Your hands and your weapons actually collide with the walls and props. You can't just cheat and ghost your head through a solid door to peek inside. And when it comes to the dynamic parrying and the procedural dismemberment, the kinetic energy transfer means that if you cleanly shield bash a goblin, the physical simulation actually calculates the angle of your impact and staggers them entirely off axis. It is just incredibly visceral. To ground you even further in the simulation, ATVR went ahead and opted for full virtual body rendering. So when you look down, you aren't just seeing a pair of floating hands, you actually see your torso and your legs. And that creates these essential spatial reference points that boost your immersion tremendously. But because this is early access, it's not perfect yet. Giving the player a physical torso means your hands can actually collide with your own chest. Right now, players are reporting some pretty serious jank when they're trying to draw a bow, simply because the bow physically interlocks with the player's own body geometry. Let's transition into Section 3, Co-op and replayability. Finding the 3-player sweet spot. One More Delve is built for up to 3 players. And honestly, 3 really is the magic number in VR. 2 players can sometimes feel just a bit empty, and 4 players, that usually turns into a complete logistical nightmare of waiting for someone to fix their tracking. 3 is the perfect sweet spot. And what's super cool is that the game has absolutely no rigid class system. Instead, the physics engine just organically nudges you into these emergent RPG roles based entirely on the physical loot you happen to find. If you grab a spear and a shield, you naturally just become frontline crowd control, physically blocking all that incoming kinetic energy. Maybe another friend grabs a heavy warhammer for high-impact damage, while your third friend states back with a bow or casts some healing-adjacent magic. You can even dual-wield shields and literally just bash your way through the entire dungeon.
But all right, we definitely have to be realistic here. This is an early access title from a solo dev, and there is absolutely some friction. Like I mentioned earlier, those bow collisions are definitely bugged right now. Beyond that, the co-op experience is facing some occasional mid-dungeon server disconnections, although hotfixes are actively rolling out for that. Also, players using PC VR headsets like the Valve Index are reporting that the game's strict requirement to hold down the grip button to keep your weapons is causing some pretty serious hand fatigue during those longer runs. And then there is probably the biggest current drawback, the actual depth of the content. A reviewer on Reddit brutally, but honestly very accurately, noted that the dungeons currently feel like a sad buffet carousel of repeated rooms and enemies. And that's because the developer poured so much time into getting that core combat engine to feel just right, so the environmental variety is quite thin at launch. The AI isn't incredibly smart yet, and you're absolutely going to see the same basic enemies repeatedly. However, ATVR has promised that expanding the enemy types, the weapon classes, and the dungeon generation is their absolute top priority for the rest of 2026. Section 4. The Standalone Quest 3 Verdict, where optimization meets hardware. Simulating all this complex rigid body physics natively on a mobile chipset, that is incredibly demanding. So to get this running smoothly on the Quest 3's GPU without needing a PC, the developer executed a really smart pivot to a heavy saturated cel-shaded art style. By stripping away all the complex dynamic lighting and high-resolution textures, they completely freed up the processor to handle all that intense physics math. So while the SteamVR version gets those juicy bloom effects and 144 frames per second cap, the MetaQuest 3 actually holds a remarkably stable 72 to 90 FPS while keeping that visceral, bloody combat perfectly intact. And then we gotta talk about the price tag, $13.99. In the context of April 2026, this is a massive deal. If you've been following the hardware market at all, you know Meta literally just raised the prices on the Quest 3 and 3S on April 19th because of that global RAM chip shortage. Gamers' wallets are definitely hurting right now. So to have a highly replayable 3-player physics brawler drop for under $14 with an incredibly tiny storage footprint of just 4 gigabytes, by the way, it just makes One More Delve an absolute no-brainer for budget-conscious players looking for their next obsession. Ultimately, this game just proves that you do not need a massive studio budget to push the boundaries of what virtual reality can actually feel like. It's a great reminder that the most impressive feature in VR isn't necessarily getting photorealistic graphics, it's that feeling when the virtual world actually pushes back when you swing your sword. So I really want to hear from you on this one. What is your absolute favorite physics-based VR combat game so far, and do you think One More Delve beats it? Let me know your thoughts, and until next time, keep learning and keep exploring.